Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Susan Eastland, and I'm a programming librarian at Cary Library in Lexington, Massachusetts. Tonight, we are going to be having a conversation with Amanda Montei, author of Touched Out, Motherhood, Misogyny, Consent, and Control. I have my copy of the book with me. I needed to buy my own because I need to mark it all up. So before we begin, I just want to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like this to our patrons. And we will be recording this talk and posting it to our YouTube channel for later viewing, just in case anyone misses it tonight. Before we get into it, I just want to state for anyone watching that I read this book and can relate to this book as a woman and a daughter, but not as a mother. So please, if you have any questions that I'm not asking or that you're wondering about, please submit them to the Q&A or to the chat, and I will happily bring them up to Amanda. So let me introduce our guest. Amanda Montei has a PhD in English literature from SUNY at Buffalo and an MFA in writing from the California Institute of the Arts. She is the author of both Touched Out and Two Memoirs. Her essays and criticism have appeared at Slate, Mother Tongue, Vox, HuffPost, Electric Literature, The Believer, and more. And she teaches writing and lives in California with her family. So welcome, Amanda, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah. So Touched Out is, to me, an exploratory deep dive into both motherhood and womanhood in the United States. It discusses your experiences as you became both a wife and a mother. It references and builds on a huge collection of texts that discuss sex, relationships, family, societal expectations, and how all of the aforementioned things intersect. Can you just talk to us a little bit about the term touched out, the title of your book, for anyone who's watching who might not be familiar with the term?
Yes. So the term touched out is a term that I learned after I became a mom in 2015. And I learned it really just sort of socially. I heard other moms talking about it, and I write about this a little bit in the book. I was working at a daycare, my sister's at-home daycare, and she used the term, and I was like, oh, that tracks. But it was also a term that was circulating quite a bit online then and continues really to circulate online. But in like the mid to late 2010s, I think when people use this term, a lot of it was rubbing me the wrong way. There was a lot of normalization happening around this feeling that mothers were getting, this feeling of wanting to rip your skin off, of wanting to hide in the bathroom, of just being a kind of like toy, for your child. And I also noticed as I started to look more at like the way in which this term was circulating online, that there were, as you mentioned, also stories about marriage that were kind of tangled in there. And so, because it didn't sit well with me, I wanted to kind of explore the term a little bit more. But as you said, the book is a lot more about sort of broader questions about autonomy and bodies that I was asking myself in early motherhood. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a term that I had heard before, but reading the book, it opens up like all these other avenues that I hadn't thought about. You describe in the beginning how one of your goals in the book was to disentangle gender from care work. And you went on to say, I do in this talk, we'll have a lot of quotes because so much of the book just stuck with me. So you said at the beginning, when I speak of motherhood, I'm referencing a set of social, emotional, and political scripts that act on our bodies, which is distinct from care or the process of mothering, which is an embodied process of attuning oneself to others' needs and vulnerabilities. I was so impressed that you like took on the task of separating motherhood from care work. I had never kind of thought of doing that before. So, what was it like finding and shaping these definitions of motherhood, mothering, care work as you were working on this book?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it is super important to kind of distinguish between like motherhood as a concept, as an institution, as Adrienne Rich put it, and as a set of like social scripts and beliefs and, domestic ideology, gender ideology, versus like the actual embodied work of caring for children, right? And sort of creating and sustaining relationships with them. But the process of kind of trying to pull those two things apart, I think it's a sort of like monumental task. And so much of what I'm trying to do in the book is just try, and the book is really like following my efforts to do that and the sort of confusions and missteps that I had along the way. And as I said, Rich's work was really influential for me. She talks about the difference between motherhood as an experience and sort of like the notion of like what mothering and care could be, and motherhood as an institution, which is all these sort of culturally, politically, religiously, inherited ideas that we have about what is a mother, what motherhood should look like, what should the relationship between mothers and children be. And what I really found, kind of going back to that term, feeling touched out, which, so many folks were talking about as though like, this is just part of motherhood, this is just part of like being really available to your children and giving them what they need, is that really
Right.
this very historically specific notion of motherhood as isolated, as really sort of without community, as being sort of trapped in the home too, alone. And then, as I said, all the ways in which the sort of narratives of marriage were tangled in there, in terms of stories of women saying, I feel like my body doesn't belong to me all day. And then I have a partner coming home and they also feel a sense of entitlement to the mother's body, and so all of this, like I was thinking about all of this, like, and then it was sort of on the heels of Me Too, and I was just realizing how all of this stuff is really connected to this culture of entitlement to women's bodies and women's work, and this assumption that as a mother you won't have any psychic autonomy, emotional autonomy, social autonomy. You'll be just sort of bedraggled and run down and constantly clawed at, that this was really connected to the larger culture that was saying, that, well, if you become pregnant, right, then you need to give up your life for your child. And, so the broader conversation around reproductive control too, you know.
Yeah, and I think you do a great job kind of staying focused on your topic because it would be so easy when you're exploring something like this to want to get into more of like the society as a whole, like how kind of men are raised and get more into feminism than like you do. But you could then just like disappear into everything. It's like you can't talk about everything in one book. So I think it's just um great like digging into this one topic and really honing in and just exploring all of that. So um to go on with this care work and gender that we're talking about, we as women are trained by society and the women and mothers before us to intrinsically know what we're expected to do when it comes to caring for the home and catering to children and men around us. As a 20-something with no kids, I see this daily when it's my female guests who like help me clean up after we host, or girlfriends offering to help with childcare, or women asking and offering support after friends, spouses, and family. So, how do you think and this is a very broad question, but how do you think we can work to degender childcare and housework and just general emotional care for others?
Yeah, I mean, it's like $1 million question, I think. And it's something that I've thought a lot about, because it has, come up in conversations, promoting the book. And I love the way that you frame this question. Usually the question is also like, how do we get men to get invested in care work? And I really do believe, like, what I've landed on thinking about this a lot and also researching how other countries like have degendered care work, is that care is a project, an emotional labor, as you're talking about, like emotional fluency and empathy, right? That these are things that men just really need to get invested in. And I also have really come to believe that I don't think that it's women's job to sort of teach them to do that. And I think we're kind of in an interesting moment where a lot of the women that I've spoken to, releasing this book and then in subsequent, writing that I've done, they are trying to educate men that they love, about what they need and to sort of de-socialize them, and kind of bring them up to speed in terms of what you said, like, men and women boys and girls are socialized differently. That's like sort of the project of patriarchal culture, right? But what I have found is that women are really at a breaking point with that. And I think it was, Eve Rodsky's Fair Play and all these books like really did bring the notion of domestic equality onto the table in really important ways. But I think what happened is that a lot of women were kind of just trying to get men on board and just taking on more labor and not even finding that their partners would meet them, somewhere in the middle. And so, I really do just think that that men need to kind of take that initiative. There are also, as I said, like there is precedent for national governments to, provide certain incentives to bring men into, we're talking about sort of informal childcare or caring context, but to bring men into like professional childcare, which is, over 90% women in the US. Um, I don't have a lot of confidence that that's going to happen on a national scale in the US anytime soon, but obviously that would be amazing. And is certainly like not something that people really even discuss, like it sounds almost ludicrous to like bring more men into early childhood education, but I do, I think we need more men in caring professions as well. And um yeah, I think it's a really important project, and that we're kind of at a breaking point with women trying to kind of lead that project.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so tough because on the one hand, I'm very like aware of and I believe that like, you know, men are good and they have these like we want them to do more or to act differently because we know that society has raised them to be a certain way. And it's tough because I'm like, I know that like if I point out my friends when they say dumb things, or if I'm like, come on, guys, like you're gonna help clean up dinner too, that they would listen. But it's like, then do they take it within themselves and do they not have to be asked again? Or like this morning, I was at the gym with my friends and I mentioned this talk to one of my guy friends. I, of course, had already told all of my girlfriends that I was having this talk. But so I mentioned it to him and I'm like, yeah, this is what the topic is, like everyone can learn something listening to it, like you should tune in. And he was like, come on, like you know me, like I know the things. And like he's amazing. Like and he does like he helps clean up after dinner and he'll just go in and start doing the dishes. Like he's amazing, but it's like there's this almost like getting offended when
Mm.
people think that they're on like the right side of things. You know what I'm
Um,
and you're like, oh, but you could learn more. And then there's like an they feel like offended or and it's so like it's so hard to
yeah.
navigate that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, it makes me think of so many different like cultural like touch points, just in terms of like what we've seen in even just the recent year with like supposed like celebrity male allies like turning out to be like not great.
Mm,
And, what we're sort of circling around here, which is like, maybe, you marry a good guy, right? Or, a feminist and find out that your marriage still feels like quite unequal, right?
yeah.
And I think it's that sort of like good guy mentality, right? That like if you're not actively exploiting or abusing women, right? That like you get it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that all of that just comes from our inability to kind of like acknowledge that misogyny and sort of patriarchal culture like exists in all of us,
Yeah.
and that we relate to it like there's like a spectrum of masculinity, and it's just like the really like overt toxic, insane stuff that we're seeing play out like on the national stage, and then there can be smaller things, like just expecting women to clean up after you or whatever. And you also made me think too that like while I don't think that it's women's positions to sort of educate men on all of these things, I think men should get interested and read feminist texts, um I don't think that that undoes the importance of what you're talking about, which are just these small moments of community with people of all genders, where we sort of notice how power shows up in our relationships and we sort of, call it out or call people in, that's the beauty of community, is that you have to work stuff out, and you have to be like, hey, what you're doing like doesn't feel cool, you know? Um,
Yeah.
and so that I think remains that's so important, yeah.
Yeah. It's so interesting, like reading this book again as someone who's not married, who doesn't have children. Um, and like as I see my friends start to get married and start to have kids, and they're in like these very serious relationships, and there's the difference between like very close female relationships and then like romantic relationships between men and women. And I have friends who are like, oh, like, I just kind of wish that like he did a little bit more around the house, and like he takes care of outside, like he does the yard and he does the, like the heavy moving, but like I just wish that like if he was sitting at home that like he might do more of the dishes, like stuff that I have to take care of when I'm home. And um my friend the other day, her mom had said to her, "Oh, well, like just tell him to do it and he'll do it." And it's like, as someone who's still single, and I've also been in these serious relationships where I let those things slide and I'm arguing with myself in my head. But as someone who's now single, I'm just like, you shouldn't have to ask though. Like,
Right.
I just don't like, it's so hard to
Yeah.
figure it out.
Yes. Yeah. It's like it's sort of like the honey-do list, like culture, right? And I think all of what we're just noticing is like there's a culture of heterosexuality, there's a culture of marriage and romantic relationships between men and women and long-term monogamy, and there's things that we work really hard to normalize, like he does this though, and he's, good. And part of that is because we are often in loving relationships with people that we're not actually extremely unfortunately, equal to on a societal political level, who even right now have if you're in a partnership with a man who has a different relationship with citizenship, and um, under the law, especially depending on what state you're in. So
Yeah.
well, we may have loving relationships, but that doesn't mean that power and history don't show up in our relationships. And I mean, I think for me, like maybe a more practical response too to what you're saying is like, is being in relationship with this person, um, when does it become just so painful, right? That you are sort of starting to lose yourself. Um, And that's something that I was kind of seeing in that touched out discourse, right, is that it was like mothers seem to be really suffering and normalizing it, you know? And that's
Yeah.
different than like, well, I never really asked him to take on these things because I kind of thought it was my job. And now I changed my mind. And then he changes, So yeah, so I just think we have to think about like what we're normalizing and why. Who is it for? What is it for?
Yeah, well, with you saying normalizing, I think like women, I think always are talking to each other, right? And like comparing experiences. And I think that's the difficult thing is that if we're all feeling touched out, then we're normalizing feeling touched out and we just think that that's it. Or that like like you were talking about the um the MLM moms or like Instagram moms now, like they're portraying that there's this life and we're like down here and we're like, but we're struggling, but we're like, but this could exist. And we don't really know about the middle area because
Right.
we're like drowning down here and they're presenting something up here.
Yeah.
Um,
Right. Constantly sort of reaching for that idealized version of motherhood, but also womanhood. And I write about this in the book a little bit. Like from a young age, if you're socialized as a girl, you're taught to think of motherhood and marriage as sort of the pinnacle of femininity. And
yep.
once you achieve those things, it's like womanhood unlocked, right? It's like you're a real woman now, right? And then we get there and we're like, wait, there's a lot of inequality here. And this is like, you know, life is hard for all humans right now in the US, but like, these some of this stuff feels really off. And that's why I do think a lot of people who become mothers have an awakening to, sort of their like feminist consciousness. Because they start to see how society is set up to really lean so heavily on mothers as the social safety net, as many have pointed out.
I think you perfectly led us into my next question. I appreciated that throughout the book you were just so brutally and beautifully honest. You shared your experiences that I think a lot of people can relate to. And just like you were just saying, when it comes to romantic relationships, girls in the society are raised to look for their Prince Charming, for their like end all be all. And we're given this expectation that once we find a husband, once we have children, that our lives will be perfect, they'll be fulfilled, we'll feel complete. But like you're saying, wives and mothers reach these goals, and then life kind of isn't what they expected it to be and what they were promised that it would be. So can you talk to us about your experience after having your first child?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that, I wonder often is for, generations younger than me, if the entrance into motherhood will be quite different, that they'll be a little bit more armed with information, stories, narratives, questions that they bring into motherhood, because there has been such great, rich writing on the topic in recent years. But of course, as you said, like we still live with these very idealized depictions of motherhood that are just not reality, right? You don't see the people who are like doing all the work outside of the MLM momfluencers image on Instagram or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, but like when I became a mom, as I write in the book, it was really pleasurable at first. The first, few months, like I was living off credit cards and like, just sort of pausing, work and, my husband was taking care of me and it's not as though I didn't struggle with like learning, teaching my baby to sleep and breastfeeding and, my body healing and, my identity changing. But it was really when I started to absorb like a lot of the cultural stories about how a mother should be, that things started to get like really, I couldn't see the forest for the trees. And I write in the book about being like very invested in attachment parenting. This was mid 2010s when that was like considered, very sort of liberal adjacent and progressive. And I didn't really question a lot of sort of the foundational texts and beliefs around that until I got further into motherhood. Um, and a lot of that teaches that you should have your baby like strapped to your chest all the time. And some of that, I really enjoyed, but it was like setting any boundary with my child I felt was selfish, and I felt like it was damaging my child forever and causing like, permanent trauma. Even though I was a feminist and I knew that I should be, skeptical of these things. I couldn't really tell what I should be doing and what was right for me and my child and sort of um, figuring all that out. And so a lot of the book is me sort of like getting to more clarity around questions of, around boundaries and consent and control in the home and in that mother-child relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I appreciated about the book was kind of you sharing like the complete ups and downs of where your brain was during these times. I very much relate to like, thinking something's going to go one way, feeling completely different when you arrive there, and
Yeah.
also just always kind of looking like outside of yourself to figure out like how you're feeling. Like I all the different books that you reference and stuff, I very much relate to the kind of like search for like what is going on, what is right, what is wrong. If society is telling me that what I'm doing is wrong, but why does it feel right or vice versa? Um, and I really appreciated your handling of consent when it came to your children. I think that's so important. And also what you said about how you're kind of hoping that, um, the people that are now having children, since, they're people in my generations or even older generations or young generations, they're going to be raising their children differently than you did, than our parents did. Um, and it's exciting. I've seen it amongst my friends to see like how they handle consent and like protection, like privacy in this online world, um, et cetera, et cetera. But speaking of consent, when it comes to your children, at the end of the first chapter of your book, you're talking about trying to help your 4-year-old son fall asleep. And I just kept coming back to like this passage. Um, you say, he has no trouble naming the comfort he receives from my body, but he also knows to ask, to seek out my gaze, my agreement, before taking what he needs. Sometimes I do still push him away, a misplaced effort to push away everything late and ugly, or a simple human request for the space all bodies need to recoup, recalibrate. Other times, I give in because I want to. As his eyes flutter into sleep, he asks if he can place a finger in the warm nook of my belly button. I wrap my arms around him, take in his whole body, check to see that he is comfortable and still enjoying the embrace. I let him tuck his finger there, pointing to where he came from, reminded that love is something we can only experience when we have consented completely. So there are so many pieces. I could talk about this one passage for a whole hour. I love that you mentioned seeking out a gaze and not just verbal consent because there's a giant difference between the two. Um, I love your blunt admission that you do deny his requests sometimes. It's so difficult, I can imagine, being a parent because as children, your kind of one singular need is for your parents' attention. But as we grow up and we start to try to live for ourselves, our parents can have trouble letting us go. I was thinking
So true.
reading this and when you were talking, my mom always brings up, she's like, I just used to carry you around on my hip and I never
Yes.
used to let you go. And she like always brings up the carrying me, like having me on her hip. Um, but personally, now as an adult, all I want is for my parents to live out their own lives. My mom to dictate her boundaries, to share her hopes and dreams, to go for those hopes and dreams. Because when our parents model that, the consent, the boundaries, the dreams and desires separate from their children, then we can learn how to do it too. So how has it been creating these boundaries for your children in this world, as you said, that pushes their moms to like give everything to their kids?
Yeah. Well, I think you just put all that like so beautifully in terms of what writing this book has allowed me to clarify for myself. That like boundaries is such a, tricky, like overused word nowadays, but like, as you said, in sort of forging a language of consent between me and my children that is not just linguistic. Obviously, like we are a chatty household, because I love, stories, and so they do too. And but also body language and looking at each other's eyes and, getting down on their level. And, there's a lot that goes into all forms of consent. And that consent is not always sort of affirmative or negative, right? It is sometimes a negotiation of needs and wants. But all of which is to say, I love how you shared the story of your own, mother. And I do believe that it is true that to be a sort of stock image of a mom who is just bedraggled and run down and a martyr and has lost herself, I don't really believe that that's good for children or society or our political future. And I think that I strive now to show up in front of my kids as a person who's flawed, who's imperfect, who's finding her way, who's deeply committed to them and my relationship with them and like so in love with them. Like hearing you read that passage, I'm just thinking back to when, my kids were that little and that period. We have a very loving relationship and but it's also important for me to show my daughter, and my younger son that, a mom can be other things as well. And you also brought up an interesting point that like, when children are born, they are like an extension of ourselves, but slowly, really every day, from the moment they're born, they start to move away. And so that really is the process of parenting, is moving away from our children. And as I write in the book, that can be a grieving process. It can be a painful process, but it's also about giving up control and letting them be their own individual creatures and hearing what they need and what they want and so like I said, it's like a dance, it's a negotiation. And I don't have that feeling anymore of like if I've reached a limit in terms of anything, housework or uh like playing some silly game that they want to play forever, like that is a bad thing, you know. um So, and writing the book, I think helped me get there.
Yeah. You said just now that the language of consent and showing your children this, talking with your children about this helps you show them that you're human. And in the book, you talked about how parents are seen as, or mothers specifically, are seen as like other and like superhuman. And there's the whole like husband saying, I don't know how she does it. Um, and I feel like I see like on social media all the time, like videos of, um, like a mother with like a child on one hip, trying to get the other child out of the car, trying to get the stroller, and the husband's just like
Yeah.
bumbling, like, and then someone trips over someone and the husband's like, you should have asked for help, whatever. I think it's we really do see mothers as this other that it should just be able to do it all and really does do it all. Um, so I think it's so crucial, like you say, to remind us that um, these mothers are people and they're themselves before they're moms. And like now that I have friends that are becoming moms, I try to like dance this line where obviously I'm so excited that they're mothers and I can only imagine what it is to, become that. And now that's part of your image and your personality, and your sense of self. But also, they're still my friend and they're still like a woman separate from being a mother. So it's like when I'm like, hey, Clara, like, how are you? Like, or I'm like, hey, mama, like, how you doing? Like, I'm like, what is the right, like, do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that like you don't want to over determine them as
Exactly.
that part of their identity. And I think part of that just comes from an awareness that that's the natural is not the right word. That's the the most common inclination socially, right? Is that when a woman becomes a mother, it eclipses all else. And I write about this in the book. I mentioned starting to work at a daycare, even though that was not at all what I was trained for, because I couldn't afford childcare. And there's this very pervasive cultural and economic assumption that when you become a mother, you will restructure your entire professional life, so that someone can be there present with the child at all times. And that's just one example of how it sort of just completely effaces your sort of nuanced, individual idiosyncratic identity.
Right. Yeah. Um,
Another example that I think of in terms of like culture that sort of effaces personality for mothers is like online parenting advice, which is like scripted now, and some of that can be really helpful. Like, I don't know what to say when my kid does this, like I'm really at a loss for words, but it has become so intense, and it's so wrapped up in the culture of like optimization now that it's like here's the script for your day with your children. And like I think it's really valuable to have a parent who has a personality, a loving
yeah.
and caring personality that acknowledges the autonomy of children too, but that is like weird and funny and tries new things sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it goes back to this like we're part of this society, I think, especially in America, where we're all, we're like shoved on the mass market train and we're all being fitted into these same looking boxes. Um, but I feel like it again goes back to the importance of like conversation and differences is that when you're looking around and um, you're seeing that people are doing it differently and that maybe it could be better if you did it that way, or you're looking at something that you definitely don't want to become, that's when like the growth happens, is when you see the differences and then you outside and then you look inside. Um, so on the topic of kind of consent and things like this, I'm gonna pull together a couple different quotes from the book that seems to me like they were kind of along the same theme. So when discussing your early motherhood, you said, the first year we spent in California, I gave my body over at the daycare. And when I went home, sitting to nurse or play or talk with Hannah, who's your daughter, I let her have her way with me, wondering whether life for some women was just a series of moments in which we grit our teeth and watch the clock. Later, in a passage about feeling touched out, being a stay-at-home mom, you say, I saw my body as I saw my house, pure atmosphere, a landscape through which my children moved during the day, which went dim at night. And then again, later in the book, you were talking about when a coworker was making unwanted sexual advances, and you say, I can't remember whether I was scared or just disgusted, or whether in these situations I even had access to my feelings. I think throughout the book, you do a really beautiful job of describing how we can feel so separated from our bodies and from our emotions. Um, And I really related to like the series of moments in which we grit our teeth and watch the clock, and not being able to identify what you're feeling. And recently I've started taking barre classes, which for those who don't know, it's like Pilates, ballet type movements. Um, and one of the instructors at the end of every class, when we're standing up from the mat to do our last deep breath, she says, shake your head no, shake your head yes. And each time it's like the end of the class, I'm kind of tired. I do it in the morning, so I'm thinking about what I'm doing for the rest of my day, kind of zoning out. And each time when she says it, I'm instantly back in my body and I'm like just thinking about shaking my head no, shaking my head yes. So, what are some ways that you bring your mind back to your own body and remind yourself of the power to say yes and say no?
Yeah, I love that. Um, well, I mean, I think that as I said, like so much of writing this book, my experience writing this book and just moving through almost 10 years of motherhood now and moving into midlife has really been sort of getting clear on like where I have autonomy in my life and choice in my life and where I have less, where it's restricted, whether that's, by economics or policy, or, politics or what have you, like the conditions of my life that I don't have control over, but there are many places that I also do, and so um, I love this question. And I think sometimes when we talk about consent, as we were saying earlier, we think a lot about like the power to say no, right? Or like the power to say yes. But as we were talking about, really consent is much more complex than that and more nuanced. And a lot of it is about identifying how power lives within relationships, you know and who has more autonomy in what situation and who might feel like they have a choice to say no, and some of those lines that you pulled out, we haven't talked about. A big thread of the book is kind of me sort of reflecting on my own sort of like sexual coming of age and what that taught me about my body and my right to consent. And trusting myself, in terms of what I wanted and my desire. So um yeah, I mean, all of which is to say, like, I think just really getting clear on like, is this a moment where I have some autonomy to make a different choice? Or is this a moment where I really do feel restricted, and then having like some compassion for myself? I mean, we're all living through a time when we're feeling a sense of political stuckness, in many different ways. And like more practically, physically, I run, which is like a great practice for getting out of your body and getting into your body.
Mhm. Yeah.
And like consensual touch, I think, is a really, really wonderful way to connect and get back into, the body.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing up that I haven't really touched on what is a large portion of your book, that um, sharing your experiences of when you, and I'm going to use words liberally here, so, and I'm talking about you, so of course, please feel free to correct me if I say something that's not right. But
Deliberately work.
when
Love it.
you when you would give your body away and then realize that, like, did I give it? Did I want to do that? I did make these choices, but was there some grander scheme that coerced me into them? I really related to, you mentioned at one point, like you felt like kind of like being like the party wild girl would then like give you knowledge to then like be like you know, a good sexual adventure for whoever was your future partner. Um, I just very much relate to the like not knowing what's right and doing things and then rethinking them later. Um, so I just so highly recommend this book because it helps you look back on, you being me or the reader, look back on my own experiences and um, just think about like consent and choices that we make and choices that we're encouraged to make. There was one part I think where you were talking about this coworker that came over to your house, um, and he started kind of coming on to you, and you used the word I could know, and like that word just like stuck out to me because like how many times have women been in uncomfortable situations and we're like we try to laugh it off, we try to make it playful as like a self-defense mechanism. Like that's how we've learned to be safe. And I see so often on the internet like women in uncomfortable situations and people in the comments saying, "Oh, well, she's smiling. Like, how is the guy supposed to know that she's uncomfortable?" And it's like,
Yeah.
like that's why the passage with your son where you're like the eye contact and just reading other people's body language, which women are trained to do and men are not, is just so crucial.
Yeah. 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 I mean, all of this, it makes me think of a lot. I mean, I think that part of what I try to outline in the book is the way in which, if you're socialized as a girl, you're sort of ushered away from your own intuition, and even, like the moment that you mention of like cooing no, like it's actually, um, a sort of protective survival mechanism that I think that a lot of women develop because we know that if you're sort of, as I write in that section, like if you're perceived to have said yes just by being there and flirting, right, and drinking with someone, then suddenly removing that yes that was actually never there, right, opens you up to potential violence, right? And so I think there's all these ways that like this, so these are some of the social scripts, right, that women learn, right, is that you can't just say, I only wanted to like flirt with you, like this is just going too far, or at least in the you know early 2000s that was not a conversation that we were culturally having in terms of consent. So yeah, I mean, I think part of what I'm also trying to unpack in the book is that patriarchal culture and misogyny, as we said at the top of the hour, are they sort of structure a lot of our relations. They become this kind of psychic organizing device, from a young age. They structure how we think and how we interact. And so a lot of the book is just trying to figure out how to unlearn, some of that. And I think that's why we see, comments like that. Like they're all just coming from this cultural political soup that we're living in that says that anything a woman does opens her up to violence, which is how we normalize the exploitation and abuse of women.
Yeah. And what you were saying, every time you respond, my mind is like, I want to respond to this, I want to respond to this, I want to. So you were saying something about um how we say yes to something, so we invite a coworker over and we're like, we don't know where it's going. We want to flirt, we want to have drinks. Maybe we didn't even want them to come over, but we start something. And then we as women to think, well, did we already kind of just agree to having sex? Like, is inviting someone over, is agreeing to a second or a third drink at a bar, then is the reciprocal to then give the man sex? And I just think it's so important to again, the language of consent, that it's not yes or no. It can change and it can flux and it can be yes and then it can be no. Or was it ever even really a yes? Was it just a border, like a line at the beginning, and we didn't actually answer a question at all?
Right. And I think that's crucial, right? It's that like it's so it's so embedded in the culture, and we're so trained to think like, well, I guess, if you invited someone over, like maybe that implies something. But like the short answer is like, no. That's,
Right.
what I'm writing about in the book is like, I wanted to have conversation, and like the pleasure of conversation with people, and just having someone to talk to. We should be allowed to desire that, and that's it, full stop. you know um but it's such a common cultural narrative that just by merely existing, right, women are the temptress. I mean, this has like Christian roots, and women, and um how they tempt men and take them off their righteous path, and um but no, you can just interact with someone, and that is not consent to a sexual encounter. I also wanted to say too, part of what I felt was important about writing some of those moments is that these are really common experiences, and we often think of violations of consent as being these really extreme versions. But there's ways in which we feel used and exploited that are smaller. And I think I wanted to articulate that to validate that experience for anyone else who has had it.
Yeah, and I mean, you definitely did that for me as I was reading the book. Um, just you did a good job of explaining the difficulty that like rape is seen as, I think you say, as this like back alley, like forceful spurt of violence attack. And it's a whole like myriad of things that can be different to each person. Um, and like, looking back on my own like sexual experiences, and just like there have been times in my past couple of years, where I'm looking back on things and I'm like, um, wait, that wasn't good. And like it's like things that you know in the moment, but it might take you way longer to actually like use the word rape in relation to that experience. Um, And I think I'm gonna always probably bring it back to like conversation, women having conversation, is that like it's so important for us to have support systems and to talk to each other, because like I could explain an experience to a friend and she might understand right off the bat that it was rape and that it wasn't good. It was very bad. And it might take me years to get to that point. But if we like have women to talk to, then when we get to that point and we can talk about it, when we can pick up books and have conversations about them, um, you know, things can change and be better.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we're creating an alternative to those narratives that we were just talking about that mislead us into understanding our own experiences, as she was asking for it. Like, it's an alternative to those kinds of ways of thinking, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna get back to some of my pre-written questions. Um, we've like talked about a lot of it, but oh, okay, this is a good one. Okay. So in the consent part of the book, there's a part where you're discussing the sexual experiences of your mother and other women in your family. And you say, talking about your mother, very young, I saw resentment written on her body, which was, however confusingly, a map on which I located my own flesh and my own frustration. It seemed she was blackmailing and bitter toward me, not only because being a single mother taxed her, but also because she was still looking for love, finding only cruelty in its place. This passage and others that you wrote like it made me think of the phrases reparenting, healing one's inner child, inherited family trauma, all stuff, at least in my world, that's becoming more popular. I'm seeing more books about it in the past couple of years. Um, you can respond to any of that, but then also, what was it like to be raising a daughter as you were reckoning with the hardships experienced by your mother?
Very easy. Just kidding. Yeah, it's a trip. I mean, so much of I think becoming a parent is like all those old wounds coming up, and every year, day that the children grow, you start to like relive different parts of your childhood, right? Because that's the comparison that we have, right? Is our own experience of being a child, um, or at least like the primary one. But I also think it's sort of like necessary work, right? Because of course we don't want to be taking out past resentments against our own mothers on our daughters, especially. Um, I think the mother-daughter relationship is just like such a rich text. Like it's a huge terrain. I think that the way in which patriarchal culture turns mothers and daughters against each other is probably something like I'll always be writing about and thinking about, and how we live with that, and how we hold on to our relationships, or for many people, they have to remove themselves from those relationships. And I don't want to say either is right or better, Um, I think it can just be like incredibly sad to see like, what this culture can do to those relationships, Um, but bringing it back to my experience, um, yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I'm like always unpacking. The first quote that you read, something that I noticed and have really thought a lot about is that in my generation, and at least with my mother, I was taught that like, well, this is just how it is. Like, this is just how men are. They're just like terrible, and I heard that kind of stuff a lot growing up. And so I think it taught me a certain feminist awareness of like the fact that I was living in a world that was made for men and for their pleasure. My mom talked like very openly about sex, but I didn't see an alternative, and I didn't grow up with any sort of belief in possibility of a different way of life, of a different world. She wasn't like a really politically active person, and didn't find a lot of sort of hope, and so I think that's something that is a practice for me as a person and as a parent, is like, well, what can I do? And how can I model that for my kids? How can we treat our neighbors with care and love? And how can we support, trans kids in our community right now? And, my kids go to a school with a very large immigrant population. Like, how can we make sure that those kids are feeling like we're here for you, and, um, so just really like kind of teaching them that sort of radical consciousness, or at least opening that door for them,
Yeah.
because I didn't have that, and it was, and I didn't have an alternative language for consent either, which I write about in the book. Um, and it would have been helpful. But I
Yeah.
also don't blame my mother, because I know the culture that she grew up in.
Yeah, and I think that that's um I'm the same way when it comes to my relationship with my parents. Like, I wish that things might have been different in my childhood, but I don't hold any like resentment, because I know that, like, I mean, just like you said, like the mother-daughter relationship is so hard. And I think it's also like mothers and daughters can have a really hard time understanding each other, but then like daughters and grandmothers, like the difficulty can kind of skip that generation. Like, I know like my mom and her grandma had a really hard relationship like I have with my mom, but like my grandma was like one of my favorite people on earth and was, only ever an angel to me. So I think that like difference in generations and like ways of care, and obviously, just like one person is raising while another one is just kind of like caring for. Um,
And
that,
100% like that comes from the incredible amount of pressure that we place on the maternal figure to be everything.
yeah,
And And then, as a child, you see that culturally and you want that. You too want, you know, that idealized maternal figure. And as kids, we're chasing it just as much as mothers are chasing trying to get to it. And so that really can come between parents and children, I think.
Yeah. Um, as we're kind of wrapping up our hour, I just want to touch on like all of the wealth of research that you did for this book. Um, throughout reading it, and I said this earlier too, but I just really found myself relating to your constant like looking for answers, reading other women's work, trying to understand, like what you're feeling, which again touches on that girls are taught not to trust their intuition and how they're feeling. But you were constantly researching. You talked at the end of the book about your husband like bringing you notebooks to fill as you were trying to write this book. Um, what was the research? What was it like researching for this book, pulling all the answers together? And are you still looking for answers now, a couple of years after the book has been published?
Yeah, definitely still looking, and I hope that I always will be, and asking new questions. I think I've been asking bigger questions about, well, I wouldn't say bigger questions, but just slightly differently formulated questions about marriage and as an institution, and um, probably different questions about motherhood too as my kids get older and as they have different cultural relationships, like not really the internet yet, but like popular culture, TV and the desire for video games, which I'm like, no.
Yeah.
Let's not open that Pandora's box. But so new questions about motherhood, new questions about really right now how to be a feminist in this time of really rampant misogyny and feminist backlash, and how to be an artist in this time when, we're seeing such divestment in the arts. Um, and, those are sort of the questions that I'm asking now, and about family and community, and how to break out of that nuclear mold, and questions about sort of sexuality, especially moving into midlife. I think a lot of women right now, who are like approaching midlife are sort of at a point where it's like, well, we've tried to fulfill all the roles and do the social scripts, and that's not working. So let's try something else. um, so that's, I think, really, really where I am now. And yeah, I mean, working on the book, as I've said, like it taught me a lot. And also just living through that time taught me a lot. We're in kind of very similar, but also very different political moment. I was writing the book, finishing the book during the pandemic, started it during Me Too, so we've just kind of moved through a lot in the past couple years.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah,
think,
for sure.
yeah, and I think we're all like searching right now. We're all searching for answers of how do I show up for the people that I love? How do I maintain the relationships that are nourishing and fulfilling and expansive and radical, um and where do I find those bits of agency and choice in my life, and how do I also acknowledge if I don't have certain choices that I should, so
Yeah. As we are wrapping up, I just want to remind anyone watching that if you have any questions, submit them to the Q&A and we can kind of finish up with anything that people have. But one last thing from me. Um, we've talked about all the different things that I mean, actually, we haven't talked about all the different things that this book goes over. There's so much more in the book. Um, but it's like a deep critical analysis of the state of American culture and how it treats women and mothers. And when I was looking on the Barnes and Noble website, this book, they have it listed under parenting and family, under motherhood. On our own Minuteman Library Network catalog, the subjects list include sociology and women's studies. I looked at these things because I feel like a lot of times women written personal development books get listed under like self-help books, while similar topical books written by men get labeled under leadership or business books. Um, so how can we make, and we've been talking about this throughout, and you also very poignantly said that it is not women's job to educate men, but how can we make books like yours and all of the self-analysis and conversations with loved ones that come from reading a book like yours important to those who might think it's not applicable to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. And I love like hearing all the different strange spots that the book lives, you know. Um, and I guess I'll take it as like a positive that like it's, genre mixing, which is something I've always, been interested in. But I think that you're so right to pick on like, or pick up on like the sort of power dynamics within that and like how even motherhood books, kind of get nicheified as like, oh, these are like just for moms, which is why I was so excited to talk with you. And I appreciate your like, just really thoughtful and generous reading of the book because so much of what the book is about is really, as we've said, like the narratives around womanhood and not necessarily even just, motherhood as like a niche topic. Um, I think I have thought about this question, of like who is my readership, and I think the book is finding its way to mothers and women and feminists. I've actually had a lot of readers tell me that they made their male partners read the book, which was not
Mhm.
something I expected and I didn't write it for them, but men should read books by women, whether they're written for them or not, because, women certainly do. Um, and it's opened up conversations, between couples, about like, domestic equality and sex and marriage. And that's amazing. That's like not really something that I could see when I was writing the book. Um, I will say one other thing too that like I've noticed in the culture, this kind of like hesitation sometimes to read books that are not strictly positive or giving an answer or self-helpy, like as you put it. Here's the one thing that you can do to like fix how misogyny like shows up in your life.
Yeah.
That are maybe sometimes painful or sad or open up more questions for you to explore as an individual. I think that's what good art does. And that's what I always wanted this book to do is, as you said, like start conversations and put people together and to talk about how these things affect them, not just me. But I've noticed like Rachel Yoder's Night Bitch was super popular. And I even, saw some people saying about that book, like, oh, I don't know, it's so dark, like I can't read it. And I think that's something for us to think about. Like if as a culture, we only want to read things that make us feel comfortable, um, rather than like the range of human emotions. And if we only want to read things that give us answers when we know there are no easy answers right now, I think that's kind of a dangerous place to be culturally. Um, so I think about that a lot, and at the same time, I get that people are burn out and like, and sometimes you want a cozy romance novel or whatever. But it's just something that I think about a lot is like, what should a book do? And obviously it can do many different things. But also sort of where are we as a culture in terms of what we want from literature and art.
Yeah. And with yours mentioning kind of like the different ranges of human emotion, you did mention like rage in the book, and I have a very deep feminine rage that I like to stoke and discuss amongst friends. Um, and yeah, I think it's very important to read and like the movie The Menu, or I think it was called like I don't remember. It was like a Channing Tatum one that came out recently. There was like an island and women go there and it ends up I'll send you the title of it because
Twice.
it yes, blink twice. I was gonna say don't blink and I was like, I know that's not right. Yeah, blink twice. I
So
haven't
hard to watch.
yeah, exactly. These things that make us really uncomfortable and make us angry or sad or whatever. I think I've been saying this to my friends as we talk about what's going on today in politics and in the country. So many people are feeling this touched out feeling of like, I wake up and the news is horrible and these awful things are happening. And so I've been avoiding the news. And I'm like, see, that's where the problems happen though. Like if we turn our eyes away from what makes us uncomfortable, then then the bad things keep happening. And so I think just what you were saying about getting comfortable in the uncomfortable and facing and delving into the uncomfortable is just so important.
Yeah. And obviously we can't live in that space 24/7. We have to, especially, moderate our news consumption and all that. But I do think we could have probably an hour-long conversation about how the manosphere, which helped, us bring us to this political moment, is a culture of affirming male resentment and male grievance, and really just kind of saying like, we don't need to look at those like harder questions about age-old patriarchal capitalist inequality. Everything that you're doing, is right. And that's a lot of how internet culture moves, right? Is that it like just you can choose your own reality now,
Yeah.
and I think stepping outside of our reality and literature and art is such an amazing way to do that. And I do think it's kind of a question of our time is like, how do we get men interested in women's stories? I just wrote a piece about this. Like, I've been thinking about that a lot without actually, making that, women's problems. um,
Yeah.
and why are they not more interested, right?
Yeah. Well, as we're wrapping up, I just want to say thank you so much for talking with me tonight. And where can people find you and your writings, and what are you working on now?
Yeah, I can put my newsletter in the chat. And I'm writing there pretty regularly. And we have actually, we're starting a feminist reading group. If folks want to come join us. So that's in the chat. And I'm trying to kind of figure out my next project right now. I'm sort of torn between two projects, a nonfiction project and actually a fiction project. But I think, yeah, all the turmoil of like recent months has made me think a lot about what I want from my creative practice and kind of like how do I want to plug into this moment and say what I want to say and what I feel like needs to be said. Um, and what genre is like going to allow me to sort of get at the truth of what I'm thinking about and questioning. So I'm like sort of torn right now. But I am working on another book. And yeah, teaching a lot. You can find me on Substack, and I always share like upcoming classes there and any other publications. And I'm on Instagram. Definitely come find me, but I know some people are leaving, Meta platforms and all that. So I'm sort of half there right now.
So fair. And also so fair the feeling torn in two different directions. I feel like that's my entire life. Like I want to do so many things. What things do I pursue? Um, but thank you so, so much for joining us tonight. You have a busy week this week, and so I so appreciate you tuning in. This book really touched me. So again, I just thank you for writing it and for talking with me. And I am going to send out an email to everyone that registered that will have Amanda's Substack link and her Instagram. And yeah, thank you so much to Amanda and everyone who tuned in. And I hope everyone has a good night.
Yes, thank you, everyone, and thank you so much for having me and for such.
Yeah.
Just read of the book. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good one.